the next hour, we want to present to you some learnings and some key messages from our project in Uganda, which is about the transition from a humanitarian to a development approach in water supply and sanitation. This session, as all sessions, of course, will be recorded. So if you decide to stay in the session, and especially if you decide to talk, of course, your contribution will be recorded. And we assume that you granted your permission for this. If this is not the case, of course, you always have the possibility to leave the session. The recordings will be made available after the session. And please, everyone, as always, leave your camera off, unless, of course, the presenters. And please mute yourself whilst not speaking. Looking briefly on the agenda, we have three main presentations that we will do today. First, the welcome is by myself. I'm a digital ambassador, digital advisor with GIZ Uganda. We will have a very short presentation by Sonia Maya, who was working with the CRRF Secretariat about the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework in Uganda. Then we will have a presentation by Henry Peter Akena from the Ministry of Water and Environment in Uganda about the implementation of this response framework, followed by a brief Q&A to get the first set of questions off. And then we will have a longer presentation on the utility model and the experiences we made in Uganda from Christine Navachwa, who was working with GIZ on this project of ours. And we should also have sufficient time for interactive discussion and Q&A. Any questions that you have throughout the presentation, feel free already to put into the meeting chat, and the presenters will try to directly come back to them. So what is it about? Let me give you a brief overview first of all. Uganda launched a vehicle called the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework some 3 years ago. And this is seen as an internationally agreed upon new approach to refugee management. The aim is to promoting refugee self-reliance and their inclusion in the country's development planning, which is a fundamental shift that you can see there in the approach to service delivery, especially in refugee settlements. And it is linking the traditional humanitarian response to long-term development. What came with this approach was also the decision to transfer the management of water systems in these settlements and in the host communities which are neighboring to the national water authorities. And this approach has been termed the utility model, which we'll introduce later in the session today. This session will talk about the underlying policy frameworks for the transition, which is the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework. And the presenters will also introduce the newly launched Integrated Water and Environment Sector Refugee Response Plan of the Ugandan Ministry of Water and Environment. One key challenge behind all of this, which we will present as well and also discuss, will be the transfer process of water systems to these national water authorities and the adoption of management models to serve the refugee population and host communities. Now with this, let me hand over to our first speaker, who is Sonia Maya. Sonia is a political scientist with 10 years experience in development cooperation. Her technical work focuses on forced displacement, peace building, governance and gender equality. And she has been working until July this year as an advisor to the CRRF Secretariat in Uganda, where she supported the Ugandan government in coordinating the implementation of Global Compact on Refugees. Sonia, and with this, over to you.
Thank you so much, Johannes, for the very nice introduction. As Johannes has already outlined, the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework is a new, or maybe not so new, international framework. But what is new is that in December 2018, the international community, the UN General Assembly, agreed on the Global Compact on Refugees. And this comprehensive framework is part of the Global Compact on Refugees. So basically this demarcates a shift from these parallel systems of supporting refugees with the humanitarian system and supporting host communities with the regular national service delivery systems, trying to integrate refugees more and more into the regular systems that are present in the host countries. And at the same time, the international community has also pledged to increase the support for host countries so that they can uphold their asylum space, which we call international burden and responsibility sharing. So compared to other bilateral cooperation, I think this is also important to mention, because we're not only looking at the local population, but refugees as a global responsibility and global public good, where all states, and especially the richer states and the industrialized states, also bear the responsibility to actually provide the support to the host country so that they are able to respond to the challenges that refugees bring about. It's also important to mention that in some contexts with these parallel systems, we saw that refugees even receive better services and better infrastructure than host communities. So also in terms of mitigating tensions between refugees and host communities, it's quite important to make sure that the services are provided in an integrated way. Now coming to Uganda. Uganda is the largest refugee hosting country in Africa, with more than 1.4 million registered refugees, and more to come, I would say. Currently, the borders are closed due to COVID-19, but we know in between Uganda actually also was very generous and opened the borders to some especially vulnerable people from Democratic Republic of Congo. But yeah, and in the world, it's the third largest, just before Germany. So there's also quite some there should be maybe more, but there's also things to learn from each other in terms of hosting refugees in Germany and in Uganda. Uganda has a very progressive refugee model in the region, but also globally. It has an open door policy. I mean, at the moment, unfortunately not. The borders are closed, but in normal times, the borders are open, and the Ugandan government is very generous in hosting and welcoming people who are fleeing violence in neighboring countries. So the main countries of origin are South Sudan. Around 1 million of those refugees come from South Sudan, and a lot of them also come from Democratic Republic of Congo. So in addition to this open door policy, Uganda also follows a settlement approach. So compared to, for example, countries like Kenya, refugees are not confined to camps that are mostly located quite far away from host communities, but rather land has been allocated for refugee settlements. They also receive plots of land so that they can grow vegetables, etc., and that they can really try to make a living as much as this is possible in the areas where they live. Refugees also have the right to work, which is also not the case in most other countries, and also freedom of movement. So with regard to CRRF, Uganda is an international role model. We have a steering group that consists of different government bodies, which is chaired by the Office of the Prime Minister and the Ministry of Local Government. And comprises also, so for example, the Water Ministry is also a member of the steering group, as well as refugee representatives, donors, and other partners. The key tool to implement the CRRF in Uganda is the development of integrated sector response plans, which you will hear more about for the water sector after my presentation. So the idea here is to really integrate refugees into development planning, so that, as I mentioned before, these parallel systems get more and more integrated. Yeah, and what is maybe also important to mention is that the CRRF also entails quite substantial shifts in mandate within the government. So there, for example, in the host communities, the responsibility lies with the districts and the line ministries, whereas in the settlements, the responsibility for service delivery is with the Office of the Prime Minister. And gradually, we will also need to adapt the legal framework so that, we're not only planning jointly, but we also really have the mandates in place so that the different government bodies can really also take over the responsibility that they need to be able to to integrate refugees into their respective plans, but also into the implementation of these plans. Yeah, so with this, I think I'm already a bit over time, maybe. I will leave it at that. If you have any questions on the overall Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework globally or in Uganda, feel free to ask. And otherwise, I'm looking forward to hear the experiences from the specific water sector and the Water and Environment Response Plan. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sonia. Fantastic. And as Sonia has said, in case you have any questions, feel free to write them into the meeting chat anytime. We will have the first Q&A block after the next presentation. Now, let's look into the water sector. Let's look specifically into the Ministry of Water and Environment in Uganda. We have here with us live from Kampala, Henry Peter Akena. He is a civil and building engineer with over 14 years of professional service in the public sector. During this time, he has been dealing with the design and implementation of piped water systems in urban settings, and currently he is managing the secretariat of the Sector Refugee Response Working Group within the Ministry of Water and Environment. With this, over to you, Henry.
Thank you very much, Johannes, and thank you very much, listeners. Johannes has given an elaborate brief biography of myself, but from the horse's mouth, once again, my name is Henry Peter Akena. I am an engineer with the Ministry of Water and Environment in Uganda. I want to welcome every listener and every participant in this brief presentation. I would go straight to present what I have for the Water and Environment Sector Refugee Response Plan, but a brief introduction as Sonia has already detailed in the CRRF. CRRF is the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework in Uganda, which is housed in the Office of the Prime Minister. My particular role today is going to be presentation on how the Water and Environment Sector Refugee Response Plan has been developed and its implementation and where we are as far as the water and environment sector is concerned. Briefly, looking at the presentation outline of the Water and Environment Sector Refugee Response Plan, I'll be looking at the background of the sector response plan to refugees and host communities. I'll also look at the policy and regulatory frameworks as per the sector. I'll also look at the roadmaps so far for the implementation of the Water and Environment Sector Refugee Response Plan. Importantly, I will also look at the sustainability of the WASH and then the environmental and natural resources and the roles of the Ministry of Water and Environment and UNHCR in the implementation of this plan. I will also look briefly at the operations and maintenance framework and the tariff plans and settings, though my counterpart, Christine Nabachwa, will explain further the operations and maintenance model. I will also look at the lessons that we have learned during the processes of the preparations, the challenges, and I will conclude and make some recommendations. Briefly, the background of the refugee situations in Uganda. As the world knows that over the years, the number of refugees hosted in Uganda has dramatically increased. This has been elaborated by Sonia. And as of July 2020, we have over 1.3 million refugees, which honestly, it is approximately 3.4% of Uganda's population as per UBOS. This resides in 13 settlements across 12 districts in Uganda. The large populations, as you all know, of the refugees results into uncontrolled exploitation of the environment and natural resources. This is inevitable because it is more or less their source of livelihood. And because of this, it leads to the erosion of the capacity of the ecosystem and leading to massive degradation of the forest cover. Uganda has a very progressive refugee model. This has been highlighted by Sonia, but I need to reiterate this because it is a very unique one in the world, the open border policy and settlement policy that Uganda has. We do not limit the number of refugees, we do not limit where they settle, and we do not limit what they do. Uganda take refugees alike, the citizens of this country. There is free integration of refugees with equal access to government-provided social services. Among others is hospital services, water, trade. They are allowed to work, they are allowed to integrate, they are allowed to marry, and Ugandans are also allowed to marry refugees. The policy and the legal framework in place to support the refugee is enormous, and it protects the refugees. The refugee management and protection is embedded into Uganda's National Development Planning Framework, which is the tool to govern the nation. What about the sector response plan to refugees and host community in Uganda? This plan was developed with a very wide range of consultations, including, among others, the line ministries that are stakeholders in refugee management, departments and agencies, including Uganda's development partners, that guided the process that began in 2017 until it was launched in 2020 of March. Subsequently, the plan was approved by the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework Steering Working Group and the top policy of the water and environment sector. Subsequently, the Ministry of Water and Environment created a subsector working group and a secretariat to coordinate the implementation of this plan. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to tell you that the subsector working group and the secretariat is fully functional and is behind the implementation and management of the sector response plan to refugees. I also want to let participants know that this response plan is a rolling plan. It's a 3-year rolling plan with a total budget of over $915 million. Of this, very little has yet been implemented. Approximately about 25% of this have been implemented, have been planned, and it is being planned for implementation. So we still have a deficit of over 75%. The policies and regulatory framework that govern this response plan, it is anchored on Uganda's Vision 2040 and the Agenda 2030 on sustainable development. As I said earlier, this is also embedded into Uganda's National Development Plan, and it is also included in Water and Environment Sector Development Planning. The 2006 Refugee Act and the 2010 Refugee Regulations and the Global Compact on Refugee and its Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework. So this plan was developed, among others. There are very many other regulatory frameworks that I cannot put it here, but I'll refer you to the ministry's website alongside my presentation so that you look at some of the policies that I could not include here at this time that is governing this response plan. A brief situation analysis and the key findings that are there in the response plan. We notice that there is heavy reliance of refugees and host communities on the environment and the natural resources for livelihood. And this in itself implies that there is heavy deforestation and massive loss of vegetation cover. And this directly impacts on climate change issues. The wetlands and the wetland encroachment for agriculture and other livelihood is enormous, and this has degraded wetlands. Water supply coverage within the settlements has been said by Sonia. It is fairly better than that of the host community. This is because of the humanitarian intervention, because of the vulnerability of the refugees. And for obvious reason, you leave your country and you come to another country, one would need support. And this justifies the betterment of water supply coverage compared to the hosts. The lack of model or the tools for selecting areas for establishing the refugee settlement. This is attributed to the land tenure system, which is in Uganda. There are different types of land tenure systems, and government does not own most of the land. Land is owned by individuals, and you find sometimes where to settle refugees is a problem. There's lack of strategic environmental assessment and environmental and social impact assessment because of a number of challenges from the environmental regulatory body. Notably, among others, there's also high dwindling of underground water resources, and this has been notified by a number of implementing partners where siting and finding groundwater has been a big problem. The institutional capacity to carry out mandated role at local, regional, and national levels has been a very big problem, and this needs to be strengthened and is clearly elaborated in the plan. There are a number of interventions that has been planned in the water and environment sector response plan for refugees and host communities. We analyzed and we ensured that what is the impact? The impact of this plan should lead to improved utilization of water and environmental resources for the peaceful coexistence of refugees and host communities. We have had internationally, nationally, and regionally the tensions between refugees and host community, but this plan tends to address these bigger challenges. And what are the outcomes? The outcomes of this plan, we all envisage that it will strengthen systems for effective service delivery, and it will restore, conserve, and protect environment and natural resources. It will improve equitable and sustainable access to water and sanitation services. The outputs, of course, we shall have an action of refugee policy, which is already in process, operational support to refugees and host community. Under restoration, we shall have decision support system to environment and natural resources. We shall have to restore reforestation, establish woodlots, provide construction material, and provision of environmentally friendly fuel.
Henry, let me briefly say, in the interest of time, you know this is coming, yes. Of course.
I'm trying to thank you very much for this reminder. Let me move a little bit faster. We have a roadmap to implement this plan, and of course, a number of the plan's activity has been completed, has been implemented. As I told you, it was about 25%. As it is seen in the undertaking for the implementation by Government of Uganda and development partners in the financial year 2020-2021. As you know, the world knows that the Ministry of Water and Environment represented Uganda in the Global Refugee Forum in Geneva, December 2019, and we presented the same plan. And the plan has been launched nationally, as I said earlier. And I also want to take this opportunity in this presentation to launch the Water and Environment Sector Response Plan internationally for the international community, much as it is in the website. And the link below, if you want to find the response plan, you can follow the link below and get to our sites. The lessons we learned is that there's a little bit of now improved operations and maintenance, and there's harmonized regional planning based on community prioritization. There's social inclusiveness, which is ensured through sustainable community participation from identification to operations and maintenance. There's also high focus on now environmentally sustainable infrastructure, including resource recovery. In conclusion, listeners, there has been considerable contribution to the socio-economic development of Uganda by provision of improved pipe water systems to refugees in the last years. Then the implementation process is also highly consultative, taking into consideration the different stakeholders at every stage to ensure different interest is met, hence high social inclusiveness in the process. Honestly, now to attain full implementation of this plan, as I said earlier, it's only 25% which are available. We still have 75% as a deficit. We really need additional resources and funding which is required to meet the objectives of the plan. A few challenges that being experienced. Of course, we have a very high demand for water supply in both refugees and settlement areas. We have sanitation management remains very low. The issues of fecal matter from the point of containment to the point of treatment is still a problem. And we have limited interventions in improving the resilience to climate change with high cost of renewable energy, which still limits the green approaches. And we also have conflicts between the host. It's still there, much as the plan is trying to address. And we are talking about subsidy to pay for services. For new arrivals of refugees who are still very vulnerable. Who is going to pay for the subsidies that is contained in the plan? We also suffered the effect of COVID-19 that has delayed implementations of funds available. And as I said earlier, we still have funding gaps for implementation of the plan. I want to thank you very much. In my closing remarks, this is the supplement of the sector, the water and environment sector response plan in the recently concluded World Refugee Day. It shows a number of dignitaries which were during the launch of the plan nationally. Thank you very much for listening. I salute you all.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Henry. As said, we will have a brief chance now for questions and answers, especially on this first introduction part of the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework. In the meeting chat, I can see a first question already directed to you, Henry. It's by Thomas Murphy asking, and more coming up, that's great. Do you want to have a look? It's about the connection between food security, water and sanitation and efforts with wastewater resource recovery. Certainly a more complex question. Still, could you give us maybe an insight or an opinion on this, Henry? It's the one from the meeting chat posted by Thomas Murphy 3 minutes ago. You're muted right now, in case you're already talking. No, we can't hear you yet, Henry.
Can you hear me now?
Now we can. Fantastic. Yes.
Great. Thank you very much, Johannes, and thank you, Thomas Moore, for your question. I kindly request you, Johannes, to rephrase this question. I did not pick it very well and very clearly so that I can answer Thomas.
Thomas, can we maybe have you? Do you want to present it yourself? Probably it comes best from your own mouth. Thank you. Just talk up. We can't hear you.
There we are. Hi, Henry. Hi, Henry. How are you?
Hi, Thomas.
So I have a question about efforts with wastewater resource recovery and the refugee population, specifically recovering water for drinking and irrigation supply, as well as recovering phosphorus from that wastewater to use as fertilizer for on-site growing operations. Have you guys looked into that?
Yes, this is now loud and clear. Thank you very much, Thomas, for your question. As I said earlier in my presentation, if you look at the challenges, vividly among others was the issue of sanitation, waste management, solid waste, and wastewater management. There is still very rudimentary systems in place, especially in the refugee hosting areas and the refugee settlements because of the remoteness of the locations of these settlements. The type of containment of fecal matter is mainly unlined pit latrine, which makes it very difficult to extract the fecal matter from the point of containment to the point of treatment. The few selected areas managed by National Water and Sewerage Corporation. National Water and Sewerage Corporation is a national utility management organization that has been in place for over 50 years. They collect this fecal matter and contain it and treat, and all that is used from it is for biogas and briquettes and manure. However, the water from the treatment is still not collected for reuse. It is normally disposed to existing swamp within the proximity or existing rivers or Lake Victoria, in that matter, for refugees living in Kampala and the host populations in Kampala city. I hope with this I have answered your question. Thank you.
You have. I greatly appreciate it. I've reached out to both of you on LinkedIn, and I hope to connect. Thank you for the presentation.
I would love to have your contact, and then we communicate and have details of this. Thank you.
You're muted.
Thank you very much. Thanks for reminding me. With this, I think we're good to go into the next section of our presentation. Thank you, Henry. Thank you, Thomas. And I will be handing over to Christine Nabakwa from Uganda. She is a water engineer who has a long-term professional experience in the Uganda water sector. Her roles have been varying from design and implementation of piped water systems in small towns to supporting district local governments in planning and implementation of rural water supplies. And she also has been part of the development cooperation landscape for many years now, supporting the water sector in policies achieving national WASH targets. She's currently advising the Ministry of Water and Environment of Uganda on how to strengthen their coordination role with regards to the implementation of the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework in the water sector. So with this, let me hand over to you, Christine. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Johannes, for that introduction, and also thank you all participants for signing in. And as Johannes has mentioned, I'm going to be sharing about the utility model and our experiences in Uganda on implementing this model. So briefly, I'll talk about, I'll explain the model, I'll talk about the transition process, where we are in this process, and also the contribution of GIZ into this process, and of course some challenges that we are having moving along. So as my colleagues before have mentioned, we are now moving from the purely humanitarian to the development aspect, and implementation of some of the sector response plan requires a transition from this maintain and protect arrangement and system that's being used by UNHCR and also its partner organizations to a more long-term WASH service provision through the national service providers. This is very much in line with the alignment to national systems and national development agenda. So this transition is what we are terming the utility model. So basically transition of management of the piped water systems from the humanitarian to the government-owned utilities is the utility model. Who are these service providers in Uganda? We have the National Water and Sewerage Corporation, which is the biggest utility company owned by government, and it has quite a number of towns and also looks at the large towns and cities of Uganda. We have also what we call umbrella authorities. These are regional units of the Ministry of Water and Environment. There are 6 in the country, and they take on districts within the regional areas and manage the towns and rural growth centers within those districts. So they're currently managing about 1,000 towns with a small population of about 3 million. And these, because of their regional nature, are also anticipated to take on quite a number of the schemes within the refugee settlements. So the transition is a 3-phase process, or it's anticipated to be a 3-phase process. And the first is really looking at creating an enabling environment. Like Sonia mentioned, quite a number of changes now are taking place, and so we have to see what changes need to be made at the policy level, but also at the operational level to make sure that this happens in the right way. Then the second phase is the transition, and then finally the handover of operations and the utilities fully taking over. So I'm just going to show what we envisage to happen in each of these phases. So the first one is we need to have a key stakeholders agreement on how this is going to be implemented, a common approach, what are the roles of the different stakeholders and how are they changing in the two different approaches, and then the timelines for these transition processes. And some of the key stakeholders that have to be on this table is the Office of the Prime Minister, like Sonia has already mentioned the role, UNHCR, of course, the Ministry of Water and Environment, Ministry of Lands, Housing and Urban Development coming in because of our land tenure that Henry alluded to, but also the district local government. So the key stakeholders here sitting at that high political level to agree on what this framework agreement should look like. Secondly, we'll have water system assessments and audits. As you can imagine, systems are constructed by the humanitarian actors in a kind of crisis mode, and they're quite hurried, and there's no really adherence to national standards. So we need to see what are the performance gaps and which measures do we need to put in place to get them to be able to meet the immediate but also long-term WASH needs of the communities, both the refugees and hosts. And then the other issue is the gazetting of the water supply area. So we have a system where the Ministry of Water and Environment identifies or demarcates the areas which needs to be supplied by a particular scheme, and then they identify a best suitable utility to manage this scheme, and then they allocate it a water authority to manage it. So this is what the gazetting process is, and it's done specifically by the ministry. So these the processes we feel should take place in this first process, the first phase, for the transition to take place effectively. The second transition, after we've done the assessments are done from a number of perspectives. We look at the technical aspect. Is the capacity of the system enough to meet the demands of the water supply, to meet the demand of water? The commercial aspects, how many customers do we have? What are the consumption levels? The financial aspects, do we have any arrears? Is the scheme financially viable? Then we look at the other organizational aspects, that are needed to be able to manage the scheme. So like staffing requirements and all these things. So in the second phase during the transition, now this is where we are implementing some of the rehabilitations, at least to meet the most immediate needs so that the system can serve the customers, but also to bring it up to par with the national service standards. Another issue here under the transition is preparation to hand over operation of the water systems from the operational partners of UNHCR to the national utilities. So we do an assessment also of the utilities to see where they are. Are they ready to take on the number of schemes that are required? Do they have the necessary technical capacity, human organization, human resources, equipment, and all this kind of thing? Then there's also the stakeholder engagement. There we have to communicate now to all the key stakeholders, both at the local level and also at the national level, about these changes and what it implies. For example, we introduce the user pay principle to the refugees and also look at their willingness, ability to pay, so that we know what will need to be done to make sure that the utility remains commercially viable. So these are some of the activities that should take place during the transition phase. And then in the third phase, we have the actual handover of the utilities, of the operations to the utilities. So the utility takes full responsibility for managing the allocated systems. And at this point now, all the management systems, governance systems of the utility take place. Are in the hands of the utilities. So the refugees, the host communities, the stakeholders are all aware that now it's the utility in charge. Sorry. So where are we at? The high-level discussions are underway at the high political level. It's taking a bit of time because, of course, like Sonia mentioned, roles are now changing. OPM still retains the overall oversight role, but some of the operational aspects are now moving into the sectors. So there is a bit of a discussion or a negotiation on how much should go into the other to the sectors and how much remains within the OPM role, the oversight role, what roles remain with UNHCR. Of course, it has the mandate of the protection of the refugees and ensuring that they are safe. So all these discussions are ongoing, and they are it's also a multi-stakeholder discussion, but also because of the varying interest is something that is taking a bit of time. So the gazetting criteria for the ministry to decide, how do we decide which utility to hand the scheme over to, looking at also economics of scale and other reasons. So this is ongoing. The World Bank has done quite a number of studies, background studies that give quite good information for as a foundation for this transition. There's been an assessment of the requirements for this transfer. There's been a capacity needs assessment for umbrella authorities, since they are likely to take on a number of these. So this will give us some good information moving forward. The utility model is also currently under pilot in 5 schemes. 3 are under the umbrella authorities and 2 under the national water in the big schemes. So when you look at the operations there in the schemes under pilot, the services are heavily paid for by UNHCR and also heavily subsidized by the utilities, either through a system of cross-subsidy from the other towns or even by government, especially for the case of the umbrella organization. So it's still very much work in progress, but at least the picture of where we need to go is quite clear. So I now come to show what we as GIZ, the program, what we are doing to contribute to this whole process. Just a little background. Our program is called the Water Supply and Sanitation for Refugee Settlements and Host Communities in Northern Uganda, codenamed WatSSUP, and it's funded through the German Special Initiative on Forced Displacement of the BMZ. It's a 4-year program with a budget of 12 million euros. It's jointly implemented with the Ministry of Water and Environment, and our key areas of support are both in Kampala and also the refugee hosting areas. So looking at our areas of intervention, at the national level, we are strengthening the coordination role of the ministry, because this is a role it's taking up since the development with the CRRF. So we need to strengthen institutional mandate to take on this new role. We are also looking at the regional level, specifically the umbrella authorities, but also the water resources management offices, to see that they can also address their needs at that level. So the utility, we are supporting it in terms of building their capacity, providing them with operational supply instruments, training and assessments and all this kind of thing. So at the local level or the district level, as we mentioned, the districts now, the district local governments take on the planning and implementation of integrated water supply plans at that level. So their plans now have to include the refugees. And so this is an extra mandate, and the refugees are quite big in number. So we are also supporting the districts to take on this mandate. Also leveraging the existing local actors, for example, the mechanics that are available, the training schools within there, to see how they can also support to improve the operation and maintenance of water supply. Also looking at the supply chain in terms of sustainability of operations. We are also looking at promoting hygiene and sanitation, but also groundwater protection, and also doing this through using the local actors. So what are the specific contributions to the utility model? We are developing an operator model for the piped water systems that is applicable to the refugee settings. This process has been started by the Austrian Development Agency, and we are going to take it up, looking at both the piped water systems, but also the fecal sludge management systems. Like I think it was Murphy who was asking about the reuse aspects. You find that this is still really quite low because the treatment for this fecal sludge is quite low. So I think we have to first address the treatment aspects before we even think of how to reuse the treated products. We are going to do an asset inventory and condition assessment for 100 existing schemes in the 4 districts where we are operating. This is almost more than 3/4 of all the piped water schemes within the refugee hosting areas, because I think the total is about 167. So we think that this will be a very big contribution. We are going to conduct performance improvement plans. This is basically after doing the assessment, we see what are the short and medium term rehabilitations or upgrades that we can do to ensure that the schemes remain in service, operational, at least to meet the water needs of the population. We are going to provide or to process water abstraction permits for 40 schemes. This is a requirement, one of the national standards at the Ministry of Water and Environment, that for every scheme, it's part of regulating the water resources. For every pumped scheme, we should have an abstraction permit so that we don't deplete the water resources. And also the capacity development of the umbrella in the north, because the area we operate is under the jurisdiction of the Northern Umbrella for Water and Sanitation. So we are preparing it to take up these schemes. So looking at the management systems and processes, supporting them with operational equipment, toolboxes, water quality equipment, vehicles, so various items on operational support, but also looking at the digital enhancements. So how can they standardize their IT system to address customer care, fee collection, but also as part of their reporting to the ministry, but also within themselves, and also performance management within the utility. So specifically, these are our key contributions to this process. So moving forward, we are looking at supporting the process. This is at the national level in the overall context of the utility model. How do we develop a coordinated roadmap for this process? So we are really engaging with all the relevant parties to see that this moves forward. We also want to have a standard systems and processes for the system audit, so that whichever partners come on board later on, at least there are systems in place that everyone can follow, and then so that we have interventions done in a coordinated way. We also want to, in the same line, standardize the procedures for development of these performance improvement plans. Which are the aspects that we need to look at? How do we address the improvements? Which ministries should be consulted, and all this kind of thing. So the capacity needs assessment and also development of the utilities to meet the expanded mandate. We are taking on a portion, but also other partners are coming in to support the other umbrellas whom we are not going to support. We need to identify sustainable funding for these utilities. Right now, government would be the best ideal situation, because it would be the most sustainable, but also GIZ and World Bank are also thinking of partially subsidizing these operations. But of course, they cannot cover all the costs, so we are also seeing how we can interest other partners to come on board. I mentioned the development of an operator model, which should support us, or at least give us a framework on how to define the tariff arrangements, subsidy plans, funding sources, and all these kinds of things. And this operator model is supposed to address, as I mentioned, both the piped water schemes, but also the fecal sludge treatment plans. So some of the challenges or open questions, as I mentioned, we need to do assessments and upgrading of these systems before handing over to utilities, because the funding also for UNHCR has gone down considerably. And these require quite high investments because of the urgency nature in which they were installed. So question mark, how do we fund these? The operational data by the current operational partners of UNHCR is also not very clean. In some cases it's available, others not. So a lot of work also needs to be done there. We have mentioned the changing roles of the key stakeholders, OPM, the ministry, and the district local governments. How do we balance the needs of these, or the interests of all these different parties? The harmonization of ownership of land for infrastructure, again, something we have discussed. Before a utility takes over, traditionally land is handed over as part of the infrastructure. And in this case, we have to ask ourselves who is going to, are private people going to hand over their land? How does the OPM and Ministry of Lands handle this? The tariff setting, willingness to pay, the recent surveys, especially with the view of COVID, from the refugee settlements shows that really almost 80% of them have lost the small incomes that they were using during the normal times. So now the ability to pay is probably even lower. So how do we handle this issue? Most likely would look to subsidies, but then who meets now the cost of these subsidies? So there's an issue of also equitable allocation. I think it was Henry who mentioned that you find that in most settlements, the refugees have better services than the host communities, especially when it comes to water supply. So how do we handle this? Because at national level, we have agreed that whoever is investing should give a 70-30 percentage allocation, but this is not always adhered to. So who meets this, the cost? And of course, the changing roles of the local governments and the community-based management structures who have been involved in this. So welcome to the colleagues. In case you have any insight in this, it's really welcome. And thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Christine. So we're bringing our own questions basically with us already. We'll still try to pick up some of yours. The first one coming up was the one, let me have a look in my meeting chat. Oh yeah, there we are, by Ronald Hansen, who asked about the subsidies needed for the refugee contribution and for how long we would assume these subsidies are needed. Christine, do we have any idea, any better understanding on how long these subsidies would be needed?
Well, right now the current thinking is that at least the new refugees who are in place for like 6 months can be excused for the time being, and then the others would have to pay a portion. I think this will depend on, it will be a case by case depending on the system after they see what are the operational costs like, what are the income levels of the refugees, and then calculate backwards to see what subsidies would be needed. For now, we don't have a clear system yet, and that's why I say it's still an open question, but we are designing a model that will come up with the best scenarios, looking at the different scenarios and how best we can look at how best we can come up with the subsidy or even administer the subsidy in an efficient way. Mm-hmm. So this is still very much work in progress. So I don't think we have a straight up answer. Yeah.
Henry, I saw you coming in. Do you want to add something on this notion?
Hello, Johannes, are you there?
Yes. We can hear you loud and clear.
Great. I wanted to supplement on the question which has been answered by Christine. As you know, the Ministry of Water and Environment is in an understanding with UNHCR on the issues of tariff setting and the management and operations of water supply systems in refugee and host community. What is agreed and what is known is that the new arrivals who tends to be very vulnerable within a period of 6 months, as mentioned, will receive subsidies both from government and development partners through UNHCR. What government would do is the infrastructure, which is already in place. Of course, it is the mandate of government to ensure that it is in place, but the actual water that is applied to refugees who come and who stay and they're still within 6 months should be subsidized because it is considered they're still very vulnerable and don't have any source of income. However, refugees older than 6 months, unlike the host community, have the role to pay for water because in Uganda, water is not a free good. I think I felt I should supplement this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have some more questions which were coming up. Do you have a preference, Christine? if the one question, let's do this maybe. I could imagine it's a rather short one. It's the one by Nathaniel Mason on how you see the timeline being affected by COVID-19, of course, and other challenges. And how do you see this has an impact on your approach and how flexible your approach is?
Yeah. I think this is a given. I mean, COVID was unprecedented. We couldn't have planned for it. So lucky enough, we have a rolling plan in terms of the response plan. And also, I think at different implementation levels, people will have to adjust to this. I think there's a lot of room for flexibility, at least at the planning level. So at implementation, we are taking it a day at a time, seeing what we can do from home, but also, of course, we are changing a lot of our working modalities to do a bit of work from home, but of course, with infrastructure work and so on, it may be difficult. So I also foresee us moving ahead or extending a bit our timelines for implementation of most of our programs. Thank you. Mm-hmm. I also forgot to mention, especially with regards to Mafe's question, that our GIZ program is actually going to provide subsidies to our Northern Umbrella for the period of 3 years that we are here. So this should be addressed at that table. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I can see more questions coming in and also some suggestions and offers, and we'll make sure to note them all down. Let's do the next one first. That was the one posted by Manfred Scheu. I think we should have another time for another 1 or 2 questions. Manfred Scheu asked, what is the status of framework agreements, in particular regarding subsidies for services in refugee communities, and if there are commitments from development partners and also UNHCR? Mm-hmm. Do we have any? Yeah.
I'll say something of. Oh.
You go for it.
Sorry, Johannes, I don't know if you asked something.
Yes.
I was just looking at the question about the existing models of standardized system audits and PIPs. And as I mentioned, we are working on this, and we have developed some models which have been reviewed by the ministry and approved. And we are sharing these with our partners to see if they can also adopt or maybe customize so that we come up with a standard one that can be used across the board. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. Is there any other one, Christine, where you think we should pick it up? One you would prioritize? We have time for one more question, I think. Or it's Henry, of course, the question goes out to you the same.
Yes, I'm looking at the model.
Yeah. The fee collection model.
The collection model. Yeah.
Yes.
In Uganda today, there is the national meter all water points, either through household connections or yard connections or public stand posts, are metered, and users normally do prepaid system. They first use, and then later on they are billed through a regular billing system by the utility operators like national water and sewerage corporations or the umbrella authorities. And for the subsidies, what is being looked for is as they do the development partners or the implementing partners who support the refugees less than 6 months. They're looking at cash for water so that the refugees who are vulnerable can also have cash for water. Those are the models for payment which are in place, just like for the host populations, both in the rural growth centers, the urban centers, and cities, which are now coming up in the country. That's the models which are in place for paying for water services. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And I can also see that we are already at the time of our session here. Our colleague Sonia, she already needed to leave. With this, let me say a big thank you to Henry Akena from the Ministry of Water, and a big thank you also to Christine for your contributions today. Thank you everyone for the time you spent with us, for the good questions and the discussions we had. We appreciate a lot, and I wish you all a pleasant afternoon, evening, or morning, wherever you are.